Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Peter Masella here. I hope you've been enjoying the videos on my channel. This video is going to be a little bit different than all the other videos that I've posted because, well, obviously I'm not in an airport, I'm not flying, but I want to talk to you about my most recent flight. If you haven't watched the most recent video that I posted, go ahead and watch that. In that video, I flew from New York City to Spokane, Washington. I had an urgent need to be in Spokane, Washington, and I chronicled how I got there. Now, if you watch my channel a lot, you know that I fly very frequently on Delta Airlines. As a matter of fact, I'm a Diamond Medallion on Delta, which means that I fly Delta quite a lot. And I make it a point to fly Delta because I want to get to that level of status because it gives me many benefits. I get great upgrades to first class, I get access to the Sky Club, I get great customer service. There's a lot of benefits to being a Diamond Medallion on Delta. So whenever I book a flight, I generally go to Delta's website first. But you might have noticed that in my most recent flight, I did not fly Delta Airlines. I went from New York City to Spokane via Denver on United Airlines. Was that intentional? How did that come about? Well, I'll let you know what the story is. Now, I originally needed to get to Spokane, Washington very urgently, and I booked a flight on Delta Airlines. I booked a flight from LaGuardia to Atlanta to Spokane. There are no nonstop flights from the New York City area from New York to Spokane, so I have to connect somewhere, so why not take Delta? I'll probably get that upgrade to first class. Things have been really good. If I'm not already booked in first class, I'm generally #1 on the upgrade list. And as a matter of fact, I actually did get my upgrade to first class on Delta Airlines for the longer flight from Atlanta to Spokane. So it was LaGuardia, Atlanta, Spokane. And one thing that I always do the day of travel is that I check the weather conditions. And you know that I do that very frequently, especially for those approaches into LaGuardia. But there are different aspects of weather that are very important to help you make certain decisions about what the airline's operation is going to be like for the day. One thing that I always do before any flight is I check the flight history. Where is the flight coming from? Is the flight coming a long distance from another airport? Is it coming from a short distance from another airport? What city is it originating in? Is it doing 5 flights before my flight, etc.? So I learned that my Delta flight from LaGuardia to Atlanta was coming from Atlanta. The flight was scheduled for around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and prior to that, it was actually making a lot of small hops around the U.S. Southeast back and forth to Atlanta. One thing that I did in the morning was I checked the weather in Atlanta, and I noticed that the weather around midday or so was not going to be ideal. There was a large thunderstorm that was going to be rolling through the Atlanta area. Well, I'm so glad that I checked that because I saw that the flight that I was going to be on, which was coming from Atlanta, was going to be delayed from Atlanta to LaGuardia. When a thunderstorm passes through an airport, things do not look very good. The airport generally shuts down, no personnel are allowed on the ramp, so the flight is generally delayed. The other thing that I noticed is that this aircraft had been in Atlanta earlier in the day and it was a little bit behind schedule because the weather just wasn't ideal. So we're already starting off with a flight that is a little bit late, and then you've got this weather system in Atlanta, which was really not looking very good. So I said to myself, I don't know. I really want to be able to make my connection later in Atlanta. If this flight is going to be late coming out of Atlanta, going to LaGuardia, and there's a possibility for some really bad weather in LaGuardia later in the day, I might want to start rearranging things around. Getting from New York City to Spokane, Washington is not super easy. There are not many options that are available to you. But I started looking at different flights on Delta Airlines. I looked at a flight out of JFK connecting in Seattle, and the connection time was only 30 minutes. That's really risking it. I generally don't want to book a flight where there's a 30-minute connection because if the flight is delayed at all, chances are very high that you will miss your connection, and I did not want to spend the evening in Seattle. So I started looking at other airlines, and that's the reason why I flew on United Airlines. I saw that United had a flight going to Denver, then on to Spokane, or 2 separate flights. The flight from Denver was a flight that originated in Denver, and I did check the weather in Denver. The weather in Denver was actually quite good throughout all of the day, and this flight was departing on time. And not only was it departing on time, it was departing from a destination that's really far away from LaGuardia. As a matter of fact, during weekdays, the longest flight you can fly on is the Denver-LaGuardia or LaGuardia-Denver route, which means that this aircraft is going to get in the air earlier because it's spending more time in the air flying, and that means that it's probably going to get to New York City on time. There may not be any problems because there's always a concern when the aircraft has not yet departed its origin airport. And that Atlanta-LaGuardia flight, well, that's a short route, and if the aircraft does not leave Atlanta on time, you really can't be safe. So I've got this buffer zone, knowing that there's going to be a long time for this flight that's in the air from Denver to LaGuardia to make it to LaGuardia, and it's probably going to make it in. Boy, am I glad that I chose that particular flight. The Delta flight from Atlanta to LaGuardia just kept getting delayed more and more. So I actually had myself booked on 2 different airlines to the same destination just in case. I did not cancel my Delta flight until last minute. Now, as you all know, I wound up taking United Airlines. This aircraft came into LaGuardia right on time, and then a storm did hit the airport. That storm did cause a delay, but I did have a 3-hour layover in Denver, so I was pretty much guaranteed that I was going to make it because I knew that storm was not going to last forever. It was a small pop-up storm that approached New York City and caused the airport to actually shut down, but my flight made it into the airport before that storm hit. Well, what about that Delta flight coming from Atlanta to LaGuardia? That flight took off from Atlanta, and while it was in the air, the storm hit LaGuardia, and that flight entered a hold over the Washington, D.C. area. That flight went around in circles multiple times, and eventually the captain decided that, well, that aircraft could just not make it to LaGuardia, so that flight actually diverted to Washington Dulles Airport. So that aircraft actually didn't make it in at all until hours later when it had its recovery flight from Washington to New York City. I actually had a 3-hour layover in Atlanta, which is pretty decent. Well, even with that 3-hour layover, I still would not have made it. I would have landed in Atlanta 1 hour after my scheduled departure time from Atlanta to Spokane. So United Airlines, it was. Everything looked good. I took a look at the distance of flights. Denver-LaGuardia, longer route. Atlanta-LaGuardia, shorter route. Chances are that more problems can occur. And I always recommend that you do things like this. Of course, last minute I did cancel the Delta flight. I recommend you looking at the history of flights. Where are they coming from? What is the weather like in the origin airport? At an airport like LaGuardia, where you've got a lot of regional carriers, there's some reason for concern, because if you have a flight later in the day, some of these small aircraft, like the CRJ-700s, are going back and forth from LaGuardia to another city multiple times. So touching LaGuardia maybe 3 or 4 times before you may actually board the aircraft. And if there's weather in LaGuardia, even earlier in the day, that is going to push back the departures of the future flights later on throughout the day. So always check the weather in the city that the aircraft is coming from. It's very, very important. Now, with this being said, and as you all know, I am a very, very big Delta loyalist. I am not putting preference to United over Delta or Delta over United. In this situation, the airlines are all completely equal. It just has to do with the time of day and the weather. So some people may say, well, I like United better than Delta because I got to my destination on time. It really doesn't have to do with anything. It really has to do with the weather, because the weather does not discriminate against airlines. Every airline is going to try to get you to your destination if they have no internal operational issues. And if the weather plays a role, everyone's treated equally. So that's the reason why I chose United Airlines. The other thing that I mentioned at the beginning of my previous video is that many of my viewers wanted me to fly to Denver Airport so I can make a video about the Denver Airport. So it worked out perfectly. I did look at other carriers too. I did look at American Airlines connecting in Dallas-Fort Worth. However, the connection time was really, really short, and you just always want to avoid that because this is later in the day. It's already afternoon, and there weren't many options to get to Spokane. So I decided to take an airline with a very long connection to a city where I knew that the weather was going to be good, and I made it on time to Spokane, Washington. Well, I hope that is insightful to you. From time to time, I do want to bring you videos like this explaining how I actually chose particular flights, why I chose particular flights. Again, for this one, you might have noticed, well, he's not flying on Delta this time. What's going on? Well, that's the reason why I actually flew on United Airlines, because they were able to get me to my destination because of the weather in the connecting airport. Now, that situation in LaGuardia with the weather overhead the field, that was a little bit dicey. I have to say, I just was not expecting it to last that long, but I had sufficient time in Denver to make my connection. Not enough time to really make an in-depth video, but it was really important to me that I get to Spokane, Washington that evening, and I made it. Now, as for that Delta flight, the money was just refunded into my Delta Sky Miles account, so I'm just going to use that for my next flight on Delta Airlines, which of course will happen very, very soon because, you know, I fly Delta Airlines a lot. So that's my story. I hope you learned something about this. Remember, check the weather before your flight for your airport, for the airport that the aircraft is coming from. There's many websites out there that can let you know where your airplane is coming from. And If you like this video, don't forget to click on the subscribe button below, hit the bell button, and in my next video, I'm taking you flying again. Thanks, everybody.